Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar, Ask an Expert webinar, How Can Septet Impact Security Costs? I want to thank everybody for joining us today. My name is Tasha Dyson. I'm your moderator for today. I've been here at Produce 3 for the last 20 years. The bulk of my time is spent doing investigations, largely background investigations and fraud. But for the last 15 years or so, I've edited every major security assessment that we've produced. Which includes some component of Septet, some component of the attributes we're talking about today. I'm joined today by Dana Frentz and Eric Martindale, two of our experts in all things Septet. I'd like for them to introduce themselves.
Hi there, my name is Dana Frentz, and I've been with Produce 3 for just a little over 6 years. Prior to that, I spent about 25 years in healthcare, security, and law enforcement. I'm a certified health protection administrator and a physical security professional through ASIS.
Hi, I'm Eric Martindale. I've been at Produce 3 for just over a year. Before joining Produce 3, I spent about a decade in corporate security in the financial services industry. And before that, about a decade in contract security in the pharmaceutical industry. I earned the CPD or Septet professional designation in 2013 from the National Institute for Crime Prevention.
Thank you very much. Before we get started today, I would ask everybody to please mute themselves. That just helps us keep the audio clear. But we do actually really want questions. So if you have any questions for us, please send them to us in the chat window. We're going to try to get to the questions as we go, but we may not get to them in the middle of the webinar. If so, we'll get to them afterwards. But we do really want questions. If you have any, please let us know. Finally, our standard disclaimer, we're not attorneys, so please don't take anything in this webinar as legal advice. If you need legal advice, please talk to corporate counsel, whether that's outside or inside. And with that, on with the show. As we mentioned in the webinar description, many budgets are probably going to get tighter for people for companies over the next few years. Proper application of Septet principles could really help make a difference and achieve certain security results. We're going to talk about the benefits of advanced planning as well as routine maintenance when it comes to Septet. And I think the place we probably need to start, now that we've said this several times, is what is Septet and why is it important?
Thanks, Tasha. So Septet, or crime prevention through environmental design, is a blend of disciplines that uses both psychological and physical attributes to design security into the landscape of architecture and just the landscape itself by manipulating the built environment or the natural environment so that it is a little more safe and secure. A simpler way of saying that is that if you design the environment to reduce the opportunity for and the fear of crime and disorder. The goal is to change the environment so that it doesn't support or provide access for criminal behavior. By designing and using a space in a way that reduces the opportunity for an incidence of crime, as well as reduces the fear of crime, just gives everyone an overall better quality of life. Typically, Septet uses 3 different strategies or methods: mechanical, organizational, and environmental. We see the use of alarms, video, access control, fence, even the building envelope and site can be considered mechanical strategies. Organizational is more looking at the organization's culture. Is there a security-minded culture? This can work with neighborhood watch groups, commercial watch groups. The whole notion of if you see something, say something, that really establishes a process for developing a positive security culture. And finally, the environmental strategies include using things such as the natural environment and the built environment or architectural environment to your advantage.
Yeah, Tasha, you asked about the why is it important. The right application of Septet principles is important to contribute to a healthy and safe environment. And they can be a cost-effective way to achieve our security goals. So the foundation of Septet is that design can enhance the effective use of space, at the same time prevent crime. So effective crime prevention programs encourage legitimate use of a defined space for its intended use, and in doing that, we create healthy and engaged communities. In addition, Septet principles should lead to reduced fear and therefore help people feel more safe in our spaces. So when our guests or employees feel safe, they're more likely to be successful at whatever we've asked them to do. And so that can contribute to increased productivity or at least decrease losses due to fear and anxiety. So Septet is also well established in the security industry. So applying these principles is often part of a reasonable standard of care or a baseline. So, you know, Septet can contribute to the security program that protects people from harm and protects our organizations from costly litigation. It's also an important part of a comprehensive security program that's made up of people, processes, and technology. Remember, as Dana mentioned, Septet includes mechanical strategies like security technology, but it doesn't replace them. It can, though, with good design, reduce the size or the scope and therefore cost to install these mechanical strategies, these security systems. It's also important to consider what Septet is not. Septet encourages ownership and enforces intended use. It uses visibility and natural surveillance to reduce crime and to improve the quality of life, but it does not use racial bias or profiling or encourage any form of racism. It uses visibility of actions to discourage inappropriate activities. And so the intent of Septet is to prevent criminal activity, not to discriminate in any way.
Right. So thinking about crime prevention through environmental design, what are some of the important principles or concepts in Septet?
The concept or principles of Septet is part of an overall security program. You protect your human assets as well as your physical assets. There's variations to the classic target hardening principles of deter, detect, and delay. The Septet has kind of added additional Ds, the designation, definition, and design. Designation refers to what is the designated purpose of the space? What is it supposed to be used for? And then definition is defining the ownership of that space. It includes borders that define where the space starts and stops. It provides social and cultural definitions as far as the appropriate rules for using the space. You can use signs for part of wayfinding. Then there's design, and that's concerned with how well is the physical design support the intended use. It recognizes that each space within the environment and the spaces surrounding it, immediately adjacent to it, as well as the larger areas around it, is impacted. You can use your natural environment, for example, gathering spaces that are designed for the Pacific Northwest is going to be different than maybe the spaces designed in the Southeast.
Yeah, in addition to the impact the natural environment has, Septet recognizes that sites are also impacted by the built environment, as Dana mentioned earlier. So the built environment includes the architectural or landscaping, other physical changes that are imposed on the site. And just as a side note, when possible, security practitioners should be engaged early in the process of designing the built environment. For new sites or sites that are new to an organization, security should be engaged in the programming phase. When the owner and architect are developing the intended use, the vision or culture that they want to convey, it's here in these early stages that Septet principles can be applied for the most positive impact, and we can adjust the built environment to reduce the scope of those electronic or mechanical security measures. You know, a good example would be a very basic example. The difference between a building with many small entries or one that has one celebrated entry. Building with many entries is going to require more complex systems to achieve the same level of security. And if those entries have to be staffed by security personnel or managed with like entrance control technologies like revolving doors or turnstiles or even just card access, the cost differential to build and operate that building is going to be significant. I got to see this early in my career. I worked for an organization that grew mostly through, or significantly through, mergers and acquisitions. And so we were reviewing costs at different sites and how much the security operations and security maintenance were costing at two very similarly sized sites. One, though, required a budget that was almost 3 times the other. The difference when we looked at it was that they were built by 2 different companies for 2 different cultures. One company had a security culture, and it was focused on limiting, limiting access and protecting their R&D assets. So they built a site that had a celebrated entry, limited employee entrances. The other company built a site with lots of entrances. It was trying to promote a culture of welcome and community involvement. So neither of these designs are wrong. They both supported their organization's culture, but one design was definitely 3 times more expensive to secure. Another aspect of Septet is territoriality and ownership. This is when the design and the culture and the intended users all project a sense of ownership over the space. So when that occurs, negative activity is noticed quickly and it's stopped before it becomes established. So they keep our intended users from even developing a fear of crime, much less experiencing crime. Territoriality and ownership are enforced through, as Dana mentioned, like the definition of space, as well as good maintenance. So the tools like vegetation, lighting, fences, courtyards, building walls, these things all create territoriality, but then keeping these things well maintained asserts ownership. So it communicates that the space has owners who are involved, and so that goes a long way toward decreasing or displacing crime and other negative activities.
You know, we hear a lot about branding in marketing and how important your brand is, and your site or your facility is a physical representation of your brand. A great example of this is the broken window theory. That's an academic theory that has been around for quite a while. It suggests that if you leave areas unkept or visibly damaged and unrepaired, such as a broken window on a building, this signals to people that you just don't care, and that there can be additional vandalism or just, you know, inconsiderateness, and there's not going to be any consequences. Therefore, that tends to invite crime to kind of move into your area and take over. Another part of the built environment would be the designation of private versus public space. And there's actually 4 of those. There's private, semi-private, semi-public, and public. And one of the easy ones that I think about is a theater. You're outside the building, that's a public space. You come up to the doors, maybe there's several theaters or auditoriums inside that theater. You have to show your ticket to get in. So now you're into a semi-public space. As you work your way through the lobby, you go up to the door to the auditorium that you're supposed to be in. You have to show your usher your ticket. That is a semi-private space. That allows you to move in and sit in your seat. If you look up onto the stage, that can be considered a private space.
Unless you're invited up on stage.
Right, and if you're invited up on stage, then you're allowed to. But then we even go further on into backstage or into the dressing rooms. Those would totally be considered private space.
Right. All right. So thinking about all the different components of Septet, whether it's public and private space, whether it's the built environment, all these different features, lighting, vegetation, let's sort of go through each one of those kind of individually. Let's start with lighting. And Dana, I'm going to ask you to start with lighting because I know you've done an awful lot of research on lighting and security.
So lighting's one of those few areas in security that can really be backed by science. The IES, or the Illuminating Engineering Society, has put together basically a 14-pound book that tells you how you should do lighting. But there's also a section of it for security lighting. And lighting can be really a relatively inexpensive fix. Well-lit areas make people feel better. Now, when we get into feelings, that's kind of hard to define what that is because we all feel a little different under different circumstances. But a well-lit area does tend to make people feel a little bit better. So go out and take a look at your parking lot at night. Are all the light fixtures working? Look at the building lights. If they're out, fix them. Is it a fixture? Is it a bulb? Is it just not the right kind of light for that location? Pay attention to the types of fixtures and bulbs that are used. There's a municipality we did a survey for that had these beautiful time period antique looking pole lights. And they were pretty, but they did not put out the amount of light that was needed or recommended. Another thing to think about is your light color and how that impacts perception. Light color can come in like the yellow, like that's on this image here, the high pressure sodium vapor. You could have incandescent, or you can have the highly blue light spectrum of an LED.
Dana, can I tell a story about how light color impacted the subjective, like
Sure.
how light made someone feel? So we used a bank drive-through that had a night drop and an ATM under it as a test site. So the lights were measured. We had a baseline of the existing kind of mix of incandescent and fluorescent. And then they were replaced with LEDs, and this is a number of years back. And we took another measurement and found that the actual measured light was very, very close, like just decimal points, very small decimal points difference. But when you asked the users, it was like we had made a really significant change. And so that cooler, bluer light of an LED versus I mean, and we weren't even talking about really orange sodium vapor or anything. Just made it had a very large psychological impact.
And there are lighting requirements for ATMs and night deposits, aren't there? I mean, literally foot candle or lux measurements, yeah?
Yeah, in many states and some cities, yep.
Yep.
Another one to think about is wall packs. Wall packs, you see a lot of those in loading dock areas. And it does a great job of lighting up right there, the edges of the building. But when you back the trucks up to the loading dock door, in some cases, it will either totally eliminate the illumination or make it much more narrow. This here on this image, there's a person standing at the end of that dark hole, and that is about where the cab of the truck is.
Trust us, he's there.
I'm sorry?
Trust us, he's there. You just can't see.
Yeah, he is there because I took this picture. But the thing we need to think about is there's nobody by the back end of those trucks because they're pushed up against the building. So where are the people? The people are going to be out by the cabs of the trucks. So that's the area that I would recommend that we light up. Another thing to think about is we had a client that had a parking lot that had great pole lights, but they also had
lights on the top of the deck.
Yeah, it was lights up on top of the deck that the deck was built in a residential / commercial area. So when they lit it up at night, the residential folks got really upset, and instead of having, you know, the dollars after the fact to be able to fix it and have that lit up there, they just shut all the lights off.
Yeah, you know, as you mentioned, the IES has measurable recommended practice guidelines or recommended practices that function as guidelines for lighting and parking structures. But achieving them can be challenging. So it might be less expensive to do what that one site that Dana was talking about did, and place lights in the center and elevate them and direct that light down. But it's really likely to create light trespass. So as Dana mentioned and the client understood, it's really expensive to go back and redo something that to solve a problem. You know, an effective design for a parking deck that's, you know, has neighbors that are concerned about light nearby would be to place the light poles in the exterior, to use full cutoff fixtures, directing the light back toward the center of the deck. I mean, there's always going to be a brightness to it, but you can reduce the glare and the nuisance. But sometimes it's not as simple as that. As Tasha mentioned, some states have specific lighting guidelines for night or after hours or services for banks. We built a new branch that was designed with those expectations in mind. It was consistent at like very minimal level, consistent with the state's requirements. But it was near residences, and the lighting package, while it was well designed. We didn't design it; we just reviewed it. But it had full cutoff fixtures. There was literally no measurable light trespass. Like a few feet off the site with the light meter, whatever the real name for that is, it could not measure an increase in light when our lights were turned off or turned on. But the neighbors said it was too bright, and I think we ended up having to. It was considered a nuisance. I think the city made us deactivate many of those lights that the state required. So with that in mind, lighting needs to be scaled for use. More light isn't always better. You've got this great shot here of, you know, somebody, Dana here is showing us the difference between how well you can see her with the glare versus not. So consistency, so you don't have light and dark areas near each other. Projection, as this one shows, you know, the light's facing the person who's taking the photo, and scale, they all have a significant impact on the effectiveness of lighting. So it also needs to be engineered or designed with landscaping in mind, right? So we've all seen this in every parking deck everywhere. The trees and the light poles are in a similar place. So when trees are first planted, it doesn't really matter that they're located near the lights, but as they mature, the lights become less effective, like this one.
Yeah, I think we have this picture for every security assessment we've ever done. I think almost everywhere we've ever been, it's lights and trees, and trees, which sort of brings us kind of to the next section of Septet to talk about, and I suppose that's vegetation.
Yeah, you know, as you just mentioned, it's a common thing. So vegetation is one of the easiest problems to fix, but it's an ongoing challenge. By nature, pun intended, it's constantly changing. Vegetation can be helpful in defining space or enforcing boundaries, or occasionally even like screening undesirable areas. But the consistent challenges is that it can create obstructed visibility or obstructions to the lights. When people or cameras are blocked by vegetation, then the surveillance, the casual or natural surveillance that Septet relies on becomes a challenge.
For example, in this photo, you can't even see the parking lot at all. What casual surveillance of the parking lot?
Yeah, nobody outside can see in on that for sure.
Correct.
And well, you know, the folks inside can't see out. So, you know, you want to maintain sight lines related to the perspective of occupants, as well as passing vehicles and pedestrians, and even from cameras. So that visibility allows the neutral outsiders, like the passersby in cars or on foot, as well as our users who have taken ownership, to have real clear sight lines. And so when they have casual surveillance around the site, it supports CPTED principles.
So another conflict with lighting, as we said, is vegetation. Pole lights are often planted, or trees are often planted next to pole lights in the middle of the islands, in the middle of the parking lots. And as Eric said, you know, they tend to grow and grow quickly and encroach in on the lights. In another instance where a lighting package would use shorter poles or slower growing vegetation, you're gonna maybe have a little more upfront cost, but over time, you're gonna have a lot less maintenance cost, especially over a period of years. Typically, organizations, municipalities will have a vegetation plan, but that's almost always based on aesthetics. Rarely do we come across a security vegetation plan. So that's something to keep in mind, that you really need to have that. Another client that we had nice pole lights, nice trees. All of a sudden the trees grew.
Big, beautiful oak trees.
Yeah, big, beautiful oak trees. They were very mature. So they couldn't very well cut them down. So what they decided to do is they brought in pole lights that are similar to what you see along the interstate. So you have these ginormous pole lights with these smaller pole lights that have been encroached upon by the oak trees. And I'm sure that they paid a lot of money to try to fix this, but it didn't really fix it, because now they just had the canopy of the trees creating shadows onto the pavement. So it didn't really fix it, and it looked really, really odd.
Yeah, so if you're designing or redesigning a space, of course, think how vegetation is going to change over time. As Dana mentioned, planting a shrub planting a shrub that grows quickly, that'll reach a mature height, is the inexpensive way of having large shrubs. But as Dana mentioned, it's going to cost you more in maintenance than buying a smaller, slower growing variety that might be more appropriate 5 and 10 and even 20 years down the road. One site we built a branch in Florida, and based off of where it was, it needed to have good camera coverage of all the driveways. Because of wind loads and that sort of thing, we weren't allowed to put lights on poles, or cameras on poles. So we had to put them on the building, which isn't a terrible idea. It helps a lot with infrastructure. And so these cameras are on the building, looking out across the parking lot toward the driveways. And it was great. When we walked away, everything was just fine. A few years later, we were taking a look at it, and there were these beautiful palm trees right in front of the camera. Thankfully, they grew quickly, and we only had to wait a few years for the palm canopies to grow above the cameras, and then we could see under them. But it's just one of those things where a little circle that designates a palm tree on the plan didn't really affect the design that we had, and it probably should have.
And I so wish we had a picture of the palm trees, but we don't. But we do have this one where there's an entrance behind all of those bushes. And when this facility was opened, those bushes were not that big, but they are now.
Yeah, and you want to attract people to that entrance, and that's not attractive, especially not, when it's dark.
Right.
So another point about vegetation is if it's near fences. There's a number of things to consider. Sometimes hostile vegetation can increase the effectiveness of a fence, right? So if you've got a real low end, pretty safe hostile vegetation would be like hollies that are just prickly. Then there's the really long thorny stuff. Even I've heard about woven cactuses to make a fence. So you might need to be careful using hostile vegetation. There may be legal concerns, so just be aware of that. But you should avoid planting trees. This should be self-explanatory near fence lines, because they often become climbing aids and reduce visibility of the fence.
So as long as we're talking about fencing, let's talk about fencing, and let's talk about the built environment as a function of Septet. So what do we know about fencing?
So like Eric mentioned, you need to be careful of your fence lines. And we always recommend that you at least quarterly check your fence lines. What is not growing in December will be going like gangbusters come May. And so you're going to want to keep that cleared off. Some of the standoff they typically say is by 30 feet on either side of the fence. And we realize that recommendation is kind of hard to keep unless you're in the federal government. But what we would say is pay attention to the trees. Even if they're a little off the fence line, what would happen if that tree would fall over on that fence? The last thing you want after a windstorm or a hurricane comes through, especially where we're living, is to have a big tree fall over on a fence. And now you're going to have to deal with fencing issues as well as all the rest of the disaster.
Yeah, well-planned, well-maintained fences are definitely an important part of the built environment. We got a couple examples I like to share. We had a site in the North Carolina mountains where there's a neighboring business. They had a loading dock and storage area that is just unsightly. So our employees wanted to screen it from view. So they asked the local facilities group to install a fence. They used a solid opaque vinyl panel fence. It was like 7 feet tall. It did its job. It screened the area well. Our security fence wouldn't have been appropriate because it's not designed to limit visibility. So, it solved that problem. However, when we got into the fall and it started to get dark earlier and our employees were going outside and it was dark, they were walking around this fence to get to their parking area. And so more than once, they walked around the fence and were surprised to meet somebody who was loitering in that space. There were no violent collisions or anything, but just that startle of not being able to see your environment you're about to walk into was creating fear for them. So we eventually were able to remove some of the vertical slats in the last few panels of that fence and able to get balanced screening and visibility, and that resolved that conflict. And another story I love to tell is about how fencing can impact bank robberies. We had a site that had a long-term consistent problem with bank robberies, and we had tried a number of different countermeasures. But I mean, it's a site that's open to the public, and so it also had a number of driveways. So there's no way to, we're not closing the doors or putting a fence up that has gates, so you have to have permission to get in or anything. But we did, the leadership did listen, and we did put a fence up. And it was our standard security fence. And what that really did is force pedestrians to go through specific areas. That completely stopped the bank robbery history of that site. It had a repeatable pattern. And then fencing was installed, and last I knew, had a number of years of no history. So that's a great example of adjusting the built environment to eliminate a violent crime entirely.
All right, what else do we know about the built environment besides fences?
So think about, one of the big problems that we don't like to have is tagging and gang graffiti, things like that. So they've started using art and different murals to show ownership. And they've proven that if people take ownership in their area, it's going to be maintained better and people feel happier there. Here's a picture of a light box for a stoplight that in downtown Raleigh that's been painted up, and it's kind of fun and whimsical. And I bet you're going to have a lot less tagging on that box than the ugly green ones that they have on some of the other corners. So we're seeing that used a whole lot more in the built environment. The city of Durham has actually had their property designers trained in Septet, and they're using different artwork and murals. And then there's what I like to call the good graffiti. They have found that really does breathe life back into communities. Street art can be seen as an important part of the history and the identity of many cities.
I'm thinking about in Raleigh, especially, there's a mural right as you come in on South McDowell that says Raleigh, y'all. Yeah, I mean, welcome to Raleigh, y'all. So I think one of the other ways to denote ownership is maintenance.
Yes.
Let's talk about maintenance for a minute.
So we talked a little bit earlier about how you promote your brand, and it's a physical representation of your brand. And, like it or not, appearances do mean a lot. So keep your property in order, keep things cleaned up, don't let debris stack up. And then there's what we like to call the attractive nuisance. That might be metal that people would want to steal to make money, or, in this image here, we have metal and we also have pine straw. And you can tell that pine straw has been there for a little bit. So, think about things like that. We had a facility that we surveyed in the Northeast that had a below grade parking deck. And in that parking deck, they had, the staff had told us that they really didn't like parking below the first floor because it just, you know, made them feel unsafe. So we go down there and we're doing our light measurements and all, and it's measuring the same as the other floors, the second and third floors are. But we noticed, yeah, it just doesn't feel as good. And then we realized that it's just because it was dirty. There was a lot of exhaust film, salt and sand, because it is in the Northeast. They'd had a lot of snow that year, and all it needed was a good pressure washing. Another example that we found in a parking deck is someone had decided that the lower half of the deck should be painted black. Now, I'm sure they did that because they figured, hey, that's not going to show dirt as badly. But what that did is it absorbed the light. So we always recommend using the reflective properties of paint, using a lighter colored paint if you're going to have to paint your deck. Other things to think about for good housekeeping is like in these images here, we have a busted light. Nobody, you know, really cares. Doesn't make you feel like that's anyone cares for it. The lenses on those other lights, they're burned in, and that's a cheap fix. Get new lenses for those light fixtures. And then my favorite's the one on the bottom. That is a big pole light full of bugs.
Which
And
is just
aside from being
gross.
really disgusting, more than 50% of that light is covered in bugs. So just think that if they clean that out, they would increase their light amount by 50%.
Yeah.
So think about the little things like that, and you know, clean up, take care of things. Make that as a part of your maintenance program.
I don't want the job of getting the lights, the bugs out of that light, but I thank the person who does. When budgets shrink, capital projects are usually the first to go. But then budget for maintenance of existing facilities is likely to be impacted and probably reduced as well. Even with shrinking budgets, it's important to keep maintenance up to date. It might look like a short-term savings to reduce landscaping or exterior lighting maintenance contracts, but letting these fall into disrepair, become overgrown, will significantly increase your cost later. The repairs or replacements to bring them back into compliance is going to be many times more expensive than maintaining them. In the meantime, any reduced maintenance cost may make your site less safe, even inviting litigation. You know, there's this image that Tasha is showing here is there is a light on that gooseneck.
Somewhere in there.
Not only is it not effective for lighting and terrible for showing ownership, but it could potentially cause even that pole to fail, depending on wind loads and how well that pole is constructed.
This is a fairly old picture that we have, but I love it because it is so fantastic that you don't immediately see that the light is there. And when you're thinking about routine maintenance, I'm thinking how much of that, I don't think it's kudzu, but whatever that vine is, how much is it going to take to get all of that off of there when they could have just hit it with some Roundup and been done?
Yeah, and many vines will leave stains or markings even once they're removed that much harder to get rid of than just proper maintenance. But like Dana mentioned, in addition to our site feeling less safe or even being open to litigation, Dana mentioned that it makes a poor statement about your organization's brand. So one thing, as we talked about earlier, is to consider that our local authorities that have jurisdiction, whether it's a city or county, may have vegetation or lighting standards or policies. They're typically related to aesthetics. A lot of Septet has made in the past 30 years a lot of inroads into design, but many planning and zoning organizations are focused more on maintaining a certain appearance or consistency across sites. So we might, as security professionals, might need to engage those authorities when making changes at your site to stay compliant, so you understand what they are and try to remain compliant, or even occasionally to receive variances.
Okay. All right, we've talked about all the different pieces of Septet, or a bunch of different. Let's sort of wrap it all up of what sort of advice would you give to our clients about Septet in today's environment?
Yeah, if you're a security practitioner, maintain and improve the relationships with those who might create problems for you to solve. Whether it's the real estate group who decides where to buy, lots or locations for your site, or whether it's the facilities group that builds them and maintains them, work closely to have good relationships so that you can influence those decisions on both location and design. If you're on the real estate or design side, engage security early so that any changes that they might request aren't as disruptive. Making decisions early towards Septet in the process, it limits expensive, time-consuming changes later. But let's go ahead and say it. Let's face it. The security voice isn't the driving factor in the design process.
Never.
We're often lucky to get a seat at the table. But an organization's culture and risk profile will determine the balance between aesthetic or culture and security systems. But good Septet can help further the company's vision. It can help enhance the culture, and it can help protect the company's reputation and assets, all while potentially reducing security costs.
Right. And I would recommend that you pay close attention to any of the project changes. Anyone who's built anything knows that things go through many changes and variations throughout its building life. But reevaluate them often. It's unintentional, but many times security is the last person who's thought about, or the last department that's thought about. Meet the designers early on so they know who you are. Think about the design before it's built. How is it going to change over time? Again, is the space going to be used for what it was originally designed for or designated for? Remember your overall maintenance. Make sure you have a security maintenance and vegetation plan in place. Have someone checking the lights. Have someone making sure the place is cleaned up and things aren't getting stacked up. New lighting is available. There's a lot of motion activated lights out there now. Several years ago at one of the hospitals I was at, we installed all new motion activated lights in the deck. So they were sitting at a low level of light, and either as a vehicle or a person would approach, they would slowly come up and get real bright. And people felt good about it. They liked that. It brightened up their area in front of them. And the officers liked the fact that at 2 a.m., if on the 3rd floor, all of a sudden it starts lighting up real bright, they knew something was going on. Another thing to think about is if you're an organization that has multiple sites in a city, think about if you fix one up with high-end landscaping, but you don't do that with another, what kind of signal are you sending? Totally unintentional, but the one that has the high-end landscaping, people are going to think that that's more well-maintained, that it means more to the company than the place that has the half-dead bushes sitting out there.
I think we saw that with a facility that was a hospital, wasn't it? They had several different medical centers in the same city, and there was a vast difference between one and another.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at this point, we're going to open it up and see questions from our participants. We do have a few. We really need to upgrade our lighting, but we don't have the budget for LEDs. Do you have any recommendations for updating our lighting cost efficiently?
Eric, go ahead.
Okay. The first step in that is look at what you have. Make sure what you have in place is working. That's a low-hanging fruit. The other is, LEDs are significantly less expensive than they used to be. Those prices are changing regularly. So if the pricing you have isn't recent, then check it out. It may be less expensive than you think.
Dana, what would you add to that?
I would say, you know, again, making sure that the lights that you have are working. You may not be able to go to LED bulbs right now, but is there something else that you can use? Make sure they're clean. That's another big thing, is just make sure they're clean, make sure that the tree branches aren't encroaching on the fixture. Little things like that can really do a lot.
Okay. Yeah, for me, just from all the different assessments we've done, I'd say maintenance is probably the first one. Check to make sure everything is working and working as designed first. Lights in trees, bugs in lights.
I would also add, look in the ROI over time. You know, if you're using lights that are either the lamps are expensive or they're expensive to operate, then you know you may have a point closer in the future than you expect, where the expense to upgrade outweighs the savings, like Dana mentioned, down the road.
Okay. We have a question. Are there any insurance premium incentives for improving the security of my company through CPTED?
I would not be surprised if there are. I don't know that, you know, different insurance companies do different things, but I think that it's worth taking a shot at and talking to your company to see if they can provide some lower cost.
Absolutely. As well, if you have a history of litigation because of things related to that are preventable, your insurance or self-insured expenses are going to be greater than if you can show a history of managing issues before litigation occurs. So yeah, it's worth a conversation.
And I would say this from the opposite direction, and that's litigation. We've done quite a number of premises liability cases related to security, and I've been a part of some of those, of just hearing the situation. And I'll tell you that the number one defense is always what was the facility already doing, and was that appropriate, and did that meet the standard of care in the area for the same facilities of the size? And if they were doing everything right, it was always helpful. But that's after litigation, so I'm not sure if insurance would pay for it up front or not. But
well, and you know, the other thing to do is, you know, speaking of the standard of care, is what are your neighbors doing?
Yeah.
You know, do they have 4-pole lights to your 2? What kind of fencing? Do they all have fences? If they all have a fence, do you need to put a fence up? There are lots of things like that again, it may not help your insurance rates, but it may help in litigation.
It'll definitely.
But in your standard of care would also relate not just to your neighborhood, like Dana mentioned, but also to your industry, right? If you know, if you're a retail commercial center, are you acting like and doing things similar to or better than other similar sites?
All right. We have another question. What criteria or standard should our architects reference for lighting levels and landscaping appropriate for the design? Lighting.
Well, there's IES, the Illumination Engineering Society, that has all your lighting information.
Yep.
There's also the ASIS or ASIS has security recommendations for lighting and for vegetation, or recommendations for better security with those that you could certainly go after, or you know, you could contact us and we could help you you find some of the documentation that helps back that up.
Yeah, I think Dana covered that.
The other thing to consider in those situations is what does the local ordinance say?
Yeah, yeah, your you know, authority. Having
jurisdiction.
Yeah.
What does your local authority say, and how can you reconcile that with security?
Right.
That's a good point, Tasha. You know, they may say you need X number of, you know, trees of certain specimens of certain sizes based off the size of your site. You may be able to group those together, or you know, remove them from the casual surveillance that you need. We had a site in Florida that, I mean, it was Florida. It was surrounded by jungle. The AHJ wouldn't let us create any visibility. You could barely see the 2 foot by 3 foot sign that they'd allow us to have by the street as you went by the driveway. I missed it the first time I went there. Unfortunately, well, we tried over a number of years to make some inroads there and never did. Unfortunately, they had a violent incident there that we were able to use law enforcement, their feedback of the event and why it happened, that these guys came literally out of the woods, out of the jungle at employees and forced them to comply with demands. And so law enforcement was really helpful in getting the message to the AHJ that visibility would help here. So we were able to make some changes there, and that even made marketing happy, because that 2 foot by 3 foot sign was visible from down the block, and people could see our name.
Yeah. All right. I think that's actually all of our questions. We don't have any more, unless anybody's got any other questions they'd like to add in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. Otherwise, I'm going to say thank you very much for participating in this webinar. If you have any other questions about Septet, you can look at our website. You can reach out to either Eric or Dana with the email addresses shown there. And you can also, for more information about just general topics, other videos and webinars, we have a link on our website to the other videos and webinars we've posted of all kinds of different topics. If you've got a topic you'd like us to see or like us to address, please reach out to us and let us know. And other than that, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.